Okay, so we're gonna probably get moving a little more rapidly now. Oh, oops, wrong thing. We have a good bit of content to cover. All right, so we left off where we finished off in terms of positive change, and um, as I said before, there's a chapter that's going to deal with change in more detail. So of course we're going to be looking at that in more detail then. All right, so leadership being inclusive, and inclusive means understanding, valuing, and actively engaging diversity in views, approaches, styles, and aspects of individuality, such as gender, sexual orientation, or culture, that adds multiple perspectives to group activities. Now, um, what came to mind to me when I thought about this was that when I first started teaching, we were given a definition of a student, and students were defined as genderless, um, and a whole set of other very neutral statements. And I found that that was not a good definition of what a student is. Um, I understood why they were saying that when you envision your students, they're supposed to be genderless, faceless, that type of stuff. Because the idea is that you have to view your students the same across the board, so that you would not differentiate your biases towards them. So you be careful of that. But I found that in practice, um, things like gender and orientation and culture are very critical parts of understanding on other people and therefore being able to connect with them. So I found it a very weird way to begin the process of trying to understand people without putting them in the context of who they were. So when I was doing further studies in education, started to realize that the theory was changing, and it started to say, no, we have to take note of people's gender and cultural backgrounds and stuff like that, because we can't make assumptions of any sort of elements that would possibly negate somebody's ability to interact with other people. So as a teacher, you have to pay attention to all aspects of the individual and try to be as neutral about it as possible. Now, neutrality is a very important thing when it comes to leadership, because the same kind of concept applies. You can't treat somebody differently primarily because of a gender bias, or maybe you have a liking for a particular type of cultural persuasion in your environment. So you have to be, what I think is a better definition of that is you need to be more sensitive to all of them, and you have especially have to be sensitive to those individuals or those cultures or those aspects of people's attitudes that you don't like in particular. You have to pay attention to the things about other people or other cultures, about their activities that you especially don't like, because you have to be even more careful with those individuals, because you don't want your biases becoming the way in which you communicate with that individual or communicate with those people, because there's a greater likelihood for you to be less inclusive with those individuals around you. And that is something that I found was a little more useful, because that actually speaks to this relational leadership. In order to be inclusive, you have to be aware of your own imposed biases and um, principles that you have that may step on other person's um, perceptions of life and the world around them. Now, this is especially becoming critical now as we have such a more fluid gender definitions and changing sexual orientation in our society. Um, I suspect that some of you may have approaches that may be more um, welcome back, Samuel. What you might find is you have a an approach to certain things based upon your principles that you've developed over time. And what we're trying to say here is that you need to be careful of making sure that as a leader, you don't begin to allow those principles that you have achieved to become something that you utilize to um, discriminate against other people in an organization that you may be working in, either as a follower or as a leader. Um, but it's only natural that individuals will be will have a bias. It's natural for that. We will all naturally have biases, and we tend to be biased towards the things that we like. But we need to pay attention to the things that we don't like, because we have to be even more critical in terms of dealing with that and being open to their suggestions. So if you have a problem with people who might be of a different sexual orientation than yours, you have to be careful with that. I know that is a problem that a lot of us may find ourselves having problems with, because we may have a frame of reference that we see that as being wrong. But given the way in which our society is changing, we have to develop little blinders when it comes to that. Now, one of the things that I've found that helps to make this work is to focus your attention not on what they're doing, but understanding why they may be engaging in activities that you see as outside of your comfort zone. This is going to be challenging. I'm not saying that you have to agree with what they're doing or what they're saying, but you have to pay attention to the why. Because if you understand the why, then dealing with their differences should be easier, because it is important for you to understand that the more people in your organization that you understand and accept input from, it means that the more connections you are going to make, and the wider the pool is going to be for making problems or solving problems when your organization comes up with it, or making decisions about how to move forward. So for example, if you're making decisions about policy within an organization, you will only see it from the perception that you have. And in order to see what the wide implication of certain types of policies or actions are, you must have people from all environments or all different types of walks of life to be able to indicate to you where you can't see what you're doing. That those frames of reference become important in decision making, which is one of the strengths of being inclusive as a leader, rather than exclusive and leaving certain people out. But a lot of organizations, inherently, because of the way they are set up, they are exclusive in nature. And that actually creates, for me, it creates a weaker organization, because they are um, they're ignoring large parts of their society that have solutions that may not necessarily find residence within your organization, because we don't look upon them as being we don't respect them then, let's put it that way. And that's a dangerous thing that we want to be looking at. So here we're talking about trying to understand people who are different to us, trying to be empathic with them, trying to open lines of communication with some degree of civility, and just generally trying to be more inclusive in nature. If you as a leader develop that type of approach to things, then you create that climate in the organization for that type of thinking and procedure to take place, or process to take place. That regardless of where somebody walks, what lifestyle they walk, we look at it as being something that is inclusive. We look at people as saying, okay, we are all part of this whole organization. We're all part of the world, and therefore, what you feel and how you feel about things is important to us in terms of everybody working together. So inclusion is a very critical part of the entire thing. Um, so, and as a leader, you kind of have to show the way. If you start to show biases towards individuals, it will create serious problems moving forward. So we have a lot of elements here in terms of inclusiveness and a lot of quotations from inclusive in terms of the types of things that we try to work through. For instance, talking about consensus building. Again, consensus building is something that takes a lot of time. You because you come to a solution on your own, it does not necessarily mean that if you vote on something, that's a problem. Actually, because voting is not necessarily an inclusive activity. Similarly, um, trying to find consensus may also be negative towards that, because consensus still means that the majority of views are what everybody's going to try to to hold to, and consensus sometimes also is negative to those persons who sit on the margins of the organization, and that's something that we have to talk about as well. Now, how do you go about including people outside of your organization, which is another thing that we have to pay attention to? Because when you are in any kind of organizations, there are people who are shareholders and those who are stakeholders. These are people who are outside of the organization but have either a share or interest in what you're doing, or they have a stake in what you plan to do, meaning that they may have an investment involved with it, or they simply will be impacted by it. Now, if we think about it from the perspective of the college cannot make decisions without involving the stakeholders and the shareholders. The shareholders will be people like yourselves. You all are directly impacted upon what we do as an organization. The stakeholders are the people who hire the our students, or who benefit from the type of training that we engage in here, and they have an interest in it as well, because what we do will greatly impact upon what the product is that we end up putting out there, for want of a better definition or idea. And therefore, we need to pay attention to how to go about involving them. Now, there is a diagram here that comes from the text that shows you how external individuals are treated, or the categories they can fall into. This is from Bryson and Crosby. And you have degree of importance to stakeholders and shareholders, and perspective or stand on the issue. I don't know if any of you all engage in looking at some of the um, meetings that take place at school boards in the United States. I had the opportunity to look at a few of them, and there was a lot of people who got up and spoke at some of those meetings, and you'd start to realize that a lot of them are very highly antagonistic. They view the issue or the change that's coming across as of high importance. They have a high level of opposition to it. Whereas there were another group in which they were highly in support of it, and they saw it as high importance, so they're supportive. For other issues, people may fall into low priority, and it's very difficult to get concepts and ideas or contributions from those groups or those people in the decisions that you're trying to make. But you also have low importance here and high opposition. These are problematic individuals. So the idea would be to engage with your external groups and try to understand why they are falling into those categories, and trying to deal with the impact that they're likely to have on the goals and objectives that you have as an organization. That's something that we have to pay attention to as part of trying to be inclusive, not only inclusive to the individuals within the organization, but also those that are outside the organization. How many of you all here have ever taken part in a COSTAT engagement activity? We've had a few lately. We've been sending around emails to ask for students' opinions on certain things through the mechanism of questionnaires. Have you all been seeing them, and have you participated in those questionnaires? No, you've not seen them.
Not really, so no.
No, you haven't seen them?
So is that
Okay.
those surveys that they usually send to us?
Yes.
Yes, I have been taking part in.
All right, because those are our way to reach out to the stakeholders, because you guys are stakeholders and you all have a serious interest in terms of what decisions we make. And therefore, in order to make better decisions, we need to get the input of individuals who are who are possibly directly impacted or indirectly impacted by changes that take place within the organization. And that's something that you all should participate in. We used to have stakeholder meetings on a fairly regular basis, especially when we were making program changes and stuff like that. We would meet with our stakeholders, and generally the student body and student representation is usually one. Employee and program people would be there, and then professionals from the fields would help to try and make decisions, especially when we're making changes to any programs. We have program committees that we meet with to be able to guide the decisions that we're making to see that they fall into areas that we are going to be supportive of or that we have support from. So those are things that you have to do as a leader, you know, to get input and get people to share in the decision making process, um, especially if it is something that is new that you're going to have to be dealing with. All right, now relational leadership is empowering. So this means that the leader themselves in the organization has to be able to empower the individuals in the organization to be able to do either, well, all of these things here. One, the levels of empowerment here that has the dimensions of the sense of self that claims ownership, claims a place in the process, and expects to be involved. That is trying to set up the situation in such a way that the people who are in the organization feel as if they want to get involved and do things. And not only do they expect, but they become involved. And the second thing is to set the environment up where it encourages people to get involved, and we reduce the amount of barriers that block that type of involvement, especially if you need the 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 skills of individuals to get things moving, because an organization can only move forward in terms of the changes that it's making if it has the necessary skills to do so. So um, when you as an individual in an organization feel empowered, it means that you feel as if you belong in that situation and that your voice is being heard, and that's the climate that you're going to be operating in. And it is important what you feel and what you say and how you feel about things. There are some other elements that we'll have to talk to, but that's one of the most important forms of empowerment, that people feel involved in the organization and they believe, and they not just believe, but they know that what they have to say is important to the organization and to the leadership. And that level of empowerment is something that leaders have to encourage. And of course, they would have to manage it, because sometimes, you can get some negativity coming through, but that negativity is coming from a place that has to be understood, because you need to understand why is there a negative response to some change that you're probably trying to make. And if you have empowered followers, that empowerment actually leads to stronger organizations, because people feel the need to want to engage and not just being apathetic towards the changes that are coming towards them. Empowering environments means the climates that you create as a leader become important, because you have to allow people to engage in experiments of whether or not things are working or not, and allow people to learn from making mistakes. Now, we're not talking about fatal errors, but what we're talking about is trying something, and if it didn't work the way you thought it would, you know, making an adjustment, and the organization can has to back you up on that. Now, that's something, for example, that used to be um, problematic, and still is to a great extent in the educational services, because the ministry would approve methodologies for teaching classes, but the techniques that the ministry recommend are based upon on very static set of information and a very static set of situations. Because if you make a mistake, what happens is that the children fail their exams, and that's because they're so focused on exams that performance in exams indicates the success of the lecturer or the teacher. To me, I have a different approach to education. To me, examinations are incidental. What is more important is the quality of learning that takes place. In fact, if the learning actually takes place, the exam becomes incidental. Students will do well regardless of whether or not, no, they will do well only if they fully understood the material. The exam is incidental in the sense that the exam is only going to measure your current ability with the content. That's basically what I'm going to say about that. But because we live in a very exam-oriented and certification-oriented environment, then it becomes a panic button kind of situation that we have taking place in a lot of institutions. So let's look at what you call it. It's called the SEA exam for children that we just had in March. Or is it this week? We have it sometimes at the end of March. I can never remember this properly. That is such a, I think, a cruel method of placing students into secondary schools, because it at that early age in the development of a child, you have a significant set of evaluations taking place in one day. So just imagine a child has a bad day, or there's a bad circumstance in the area that you have the exam taking place. You talk about for the rest of your life, you are gauged by what took place there, and that's really a very unfortunate methodology for evaluating people to move them through educational systems. Don't know how you all feel about it. It's not empowering at all, because I've always found that that environment does not allow for us to experiment as teachers, and we don't get to learn from very quickly from any sort of failures or mistakes that we might make. I know it's what we have, and therefore we have to deal with it, but I am still of the concern that is not a very good methodology in terms of doing that. Some of you all who have children may think otherwise, but that's how I feel about it. I've always seen exams as being a very negative thing in itself. All right, so empowerment across the board, understanding power dynamics is going to be important for you to really appreciate the issue of power. And there is a chapter presentation on power and influence. I know some of you all have that. I can't remember exactly who is presenting that chapter. Power and influence is, here we go. Presentation 9, Richardson and Mohammed Kimberly. You guys are dealing with that. That's on May 1st. And of course, we talked about leading change, vision and strategic direction. So you can start to see the connection between some of the elements that we're talking about here with the chapter presentations that are coming in the future. All right. So when we talk about power, power is a really important thing in the sense that we have to look at how power is arrived at and how people use their power. Now, traditionally, we look at power as what they refer to here as a zero-sum game, meaning that you either have power or you don't. This model is positioned upon the idea that sharing power is very powerful, and empowering others in an organization is a good thing. In older types or more traditional approaches to leadership, Maintaining power over people was important and was necessary in order to get things done. So the nature of power in terms of this model is going to be looking not so much only at the power over or the autocratic approach to power, but we're looking at power with, which is collaboration, and power alongside, which is collegial. So we're looking at how power exists. So people have power over us, yes, if you work in a structured organization, but you also have power to work with other people and power to work alongside people at similar levels of yourself within an organization. That's something that we have to pay attention to. So when we start to look at power, some people still look at power as something that they have to take control of and exercise over others. This relational leadership model is saying to you, share your power with others in your organization if you want to get more done. Give power to people in a meaningful way. So it means that you have to be able to give over not only the responsibility, not responsible, the duties, but you also have to give over the resources they need to be able to do so. So sources of power, you're going to do this in more detail. So there are some basic sources of power: expert power, referent power, um, legitimate power, coercive power, and reward power. So expert power is people who arrive in positions of power because of their technical information and skill levels with particular things. And you're looked upon as being an expert in your field. That gives you a source of power over others because people look to you as being an expert. Another source of power is referent power. This refers to people who are in organizations who um, show some level of competency, and the way in which they go about doing things, they they appeal to people as a form of knowledge and wisdom. So think about senior or people in your organization who have a lot of what we refer to as institutional knowledge and can help to guide decisions based upon continuity from what took place in the past to now. So it means that when we call upon these individuals, they're sort of given a reverent power because they're seen as people who have sufficient institutional knowledge that can contribute to the overall well development of the organization. As opposed to reverent power and the previous power that we looked at, which is expert power, you have legitimate power. This is power given to an individual because of the post or role that they hold in the organization. So if you're the manager, you have that power based upon the position that you hold. The problem with that power is that you can exercise it, but you also have to recognize that if you lack some of the other sources of power with you, that you're in power only because you are named as the organizational leader, but you don't have the respect of other people in your organization, or you lack the skill levels or the knowledge levels to be in that position, then your power becomes a very fragile thing. Generally, though, legitimate power is something that has to be exercised very carefully. All right. Coercive power, this kind of comes with positional power because in this position, you are able to punish people through sanctions and denying rewards or benefits. This is one source of power that we hope that people don't act upon in terms of leadership. But unfortunately, sometimes you have to, but it's one of the sources of power that exists within power structure and power and influence. And a lot of people like this because they hold people to ransom, because if you don't do this, you won't get that kind of thing. That withholding a reward kind of thing. And then you also have reward power. That is the opposite of coercive, which is you reward people, and that those rewards, extrinsic or intrinsic, they can in fact encourage people's behavior. So again, because you're the source of this reward, then people start to kind of, basically the word is pandered to you, because they know either they avoid your coercive activities, and you get rewarded for doing the things that you've been asked to do. That is not necessarily going to encourage empowerment, because that's more like um, the type of power you would utilize with people who are more of a sheep type individual in an organization, trying to get them to do things that they're supposed to be doing by either through punishment or through some system of rewards. Almost, that, which speaks a lot to the transactional type of leadership models. So using your power is something that's going to be important, because the way in which you use your power is going to start to speak to you as an individual. If you are somebody who encourages others, and you don't utilize fear tactics and that type of stuff and scare people into getting things done, but rather you motivate people, that's the nature of how you do it. Because if you, especially with younger staff members in an organization now, which maybe some of you here, there is some degree of fear associated with people in legitimate places of power, your managers, supervisors, CEO of a company. You might have some degree of fear attached to it, because you're fearful of what that person is likely to do or not do, as the case might be, based upon what is taking place in the organization now, and how you behave or work in it. So as a leader, you should be careful in the use of your power, regardless of which source you get it from. You need to be careful, because it has an impact upon the staff that you're working for, and how they respond to you is going to be really important. So you have to understand that how to use your power. Now, as it says here, in many cases, we give power away. We do it when we do not trust our own opinions, or if it contradicts with that of an expert. Now, this is something that happens a good bit sometimes when you have power. You give it away because you don't hold legitimate positions in organization, or you feel as if you're not an expert in the field. But interestingly enough, what you find happening is that um, that lack of trust is something that we might all feel, or you don't have the confidence to try and do that. But when you're trying to utilize power, um, we, like for instance here, we give power away if we do not say, let's talk about this first, because we might have some additional ideas that will be helpful. That's because if you are in a position of power and somebody comes and tells you you're doing something wrong, you have to engage in more than just changing your behavior. You have to talk to the individual and find out, well, why is it wrong? And this is obviously a position to where you'll be able to learn something about it if you don't have the expertise yourself. Because you have to remember, the way you're doing something all the time is not necessarily the correct way to do it to begin with. And in fact, there may be more than one way to do the thing that you're talking about. Um, One of the things that a lot of new people will always talk to is, why are we doing things in this old way? Aren't there better ways to do these things, given the nature of technology and that type of stuff? And that may be true, because you may be stuck in a situation where you've been looking at doing things in a particular manner because either you met it that way, or that was developed during your time frame, you understand it well. But there are new methods of getting things done and doing things that you may not be aware of. And if you are open to listening to other people, then you don't just give away your power without trading something off for it. You're getting something in return. All right. Especially if you come across an expert in a field that you have no expertise in. All right. You might also end up having power that you don't really deserve. I like this example here. You are an English major, and you would therefore should be the best person to write a report, but that might be an error. So sometimes I make that assumption and say, okay, In this class, we have some communication specialists, so therefore they are pretty good at doing presentations.